The Valderon estate had been dying for centuries, and its master was dying with it. Matthias Valderon lay in the great hall of what had once been a palace, now a cathedral of shadows and dust. The chandeliers that had sparkled with 10,000 candles hung dark and silent, their crystal tears catching only the thin gray light that crept through boarded windows. Cobwebs draped the marble columns like funeral veils, each strand thick with decades of neglect. The tapestries that had depicted his family's glorious history, battles won, kingdoms forged, blood oaths sworn beneath crimson moons, had faded to ghosts of themselves, their threads unraveling into the cold air like memories dissolving into forgotten dreams. He had been king once, not in the way mortals understood kingship, with crowns and thrones and the tedious business of governance. No, he had been king of the night itself, sovereign of the oldest bloodline to walk the darkness. His name had been whispered in terror across a dozen empires, spoken in hushed tones by those who knew the old stories and understood that some monsters were not merely legend. Armies had faltered at the mere rumor of his presence. Other vampires had knelt before him, acknowledging a power so ancient it predated written memory, so absolute that to challenge it was to court annihilation. Now he lay on a divan that had once belonged to a Habsburg empress, too weak to lift his own head. The hunger had become a distant thing, a memory of fire that had burned down to cold ash. He had stopped feeding decades ago, or was it centuries? Time had lost meaning in this slow descent toward oblivion. At first, the abstinence had been a choice, a weariness with the hunt, with the fear in their eyes, with the weight of each life taken pressing upon what remained of his conscience. Then it had become a sentence, a slow execution of his own devising. His body, ancient beyond reckoning, had begun to consume itself. The eternal flesh that had weathered sword and flame, and the slow erosion of millennia was finally surrendering to entropy, collapsing inward like a star that had exhausted its fuel. He could feel his heart, that strange organ that had beaten perhaps once a day for thousands of years, slowing further. Once a month now, perhaps, then once a season. Soon, not at all. The silence between beats grew longer with each passing moon, each interval a small death rehearsing the final one. The true death was coming, and Matthias welcomed it like a lover too long denied. Around him, the great hall held the relics of every age he had witnessed. A Roman gladius hung beside a crusader's sword, the steel still sharp after centuries of disuse. Byzantine icons shared wall space with Renaissance paintings he had commissioned himself, portraits of humans he had loved and lost and mourned until mourning itself became exhausting. A first edition Shakespeare gathered dust beside illuminated manuscripts he had helped monks create in candlelit scriptoriums, the Latin still precise after 800 years. A phonograph from the 1920s sat silent, its trumpet bell pointed toward heaven like a flower-seeking sun that would never come. Each object was a tombstone marking some dead era of his existence. The Greek amphora from the time of Pericles, the silk banner from the court of Kublai Khan, whom Matthias had served for 3 decades as a knight advisor before wandering on. The fragment of stained glass, salvaged from a cathedral, bombed in the First World War, its colors still singing with devotion and hope. He had tried music once, tried to find in melody what he could no longer find in blood, some spark of feeling, some reason to persist. But his fingers had grown too weak for instruments, and eventually, even listening had become a cruelty. Each beautiful note a reminder of all the beauty he had outlived, all the composers whose hands had stilled while he endured. So he had retreated into silence, into darkness, into the slow dissolution of everything he had been. The world outside continued its relentless turning. Wars came and went. Technologies rose and fell. Humans multiplied and spread across the earth like a tide of endless motion. And Matthias Valderon lay in his great hall, waiting for the stillness that would finally match the stillness in his heart. The estate's caretaker, an elderly human whose family had served the Valderons for 7 generations, checked on him once a week. Matthias had released the old man from service years ago, but Thomas refused to abandon his post, perhaps loyalty bred into the bone, perhaps pity for a creature that had outlived its purpose, perhaps simply the inability to imagine a world without a Valderon to serve, an identity that had become inseparable from service. "The east wing roof collapsed last month, my lord," Thomas had reported on his last visit, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone delivering news to the dying. "And there's been interest from developers. They want to buy the land, tear down the house. They're offering quite a lot of money, enough to secure my family for generations, if you were to consider." Matthias had managed to move his hand, barely a twitch, but Thomas understood. Let them have it. Let them tear it all down, every stone that held his memories, every beam that had sheltered his solitude. What did it matter? He had no heirs, no legacy worth preserving. The bloodline of Valderon would end with him, and the world would forget that vampires had ever been kings, that darkness had once held court in the halls of power. Now he lay alone in the darkness, watching dust motes drift through the single shaft of gray light that penetrated the gloom. Even his vampiric sight was fading. The shadows that had once been his domain, as clear to him as daylight to mortals, were becoming absolute, a darkness he could no longer see through. The world was closing in, narrowing to this single room, this single divan, this single body that no longer felt like his own. He thought of Alara, dead these 400 years, her laughter still echoing in the chambers of his memory, of Marcus, his first companion, lost to hunters in the chaos of the French Revolution, staked through the heart in a cellar while the mob howled for blood above. Of all the mortals he had loved in his peculiar, careful way. Watching them age, just watching them die, each loss carving another piece from whatever passed for his soul until the soul itself seemed nothing but scars. Enough, he thought. Enough of memory. Enough of loss. Enough of this interminable existence that had ceased to be life centuries ago and had become merely persistence, mere refusal to end. The darkness crept closer, patient as only darkness could be, and Matthias closed his eyes to meet it. The sound was so unexpected that at first he thought he was dreaming. If the undead could dream, if his deteriorating mind was manufacturing phantoms of the past to ease the transition into oblivion. Piano. Someone was playing piano. The notes drifted up from somewhere in the east wing, the collapsed wing, the abandoned wing, where no one had set foot in decades. Yet the sound was unmistakable, a melody so achingly beautiful that Matthias felt something crack in the frozen wasteland of his chest, some ice flow of ancient numbness breaking apart under pressure it could not withstand. Chopin. The Nocturne in C-sharp minor. He knew it intimately. He had heard Chopin himself play it once, in a Parisian salon in 1847, the composer's fingers already weakening from the consumption that would claim him 2 years later. Matthias had stood in the shadows of that candlelit room, watching genius burn itself out, memorizing every nuance of touch and tempo. The memory was sharp enough to cut, even now. But this was different. Whoever played now did not simply reproduce the notes with technical precision. They lived inside them, bleeding emotion into every phrase, turning mathematical relationships between sound waves into something that breathed and wept and hoped. There was a rawness to the interpretation that Chopin himself had lacked, too refined for his own despair. This player knew suffering intimately, personally, and let that knowledge flow through their fingers into the keys. With effort that should have been impossible, Matthias rose. His body protested every movement. Joints that had not bent in months creaked like ancient hinges. Muscles that had atrophied beyond any human recognition trembled with the strain of supporting weight they had forgotten how to bear. Yet the music pulled at him with a force he could not resist, a gravity more powerful than his own dissolution, more compelling than the death that had seemed so welcome moments before. He made his way through corridors choked with debris and memory, past the library where he had spent entire decades reading, consuming the written thoughts of humans as he could, no longer consume their blood, past the gallery where portraits of the dead watched with painted eyes that seemed to follow his shuffling progress, past rooms that had hosted coronations and conspiracies and quiet moments of impossible love, now shrouded in the dust of abandonment. The east wing was worse than Thomas had described. Half the roof had indeed collapsed, letting in the gray autumn light and the smell of rain-wet leaves and the cold kiss of open air. Plaster dust covered everything like snow, muffling the colors of destruction. Furniture lay broken and scattered, casualties of gravity and time, the detritus of an estate that had surrendered to entropy. And in the midst of this ruin, beneath a ceiling open to the weeping sky, sat a young woman at a grand piano. The instrument should not have survived. It was a Bösendorfer, 200 years old, a gift from a countess whose name Matthias could no longer recall but whose gratitude he remembered. He had saved her son from a blood plague, one of the last acts of kindness he had permitted himself. Yet somehow, the piano stood intact amidst the destruction, as if the collapse had carefully arranged itself around this single precious thing. And the woman's fingers moved across its keys with a familiarity that suggested she had been born to play it, that her hands had been shaped in the womb for exactly this purpose. She was perhaps 30, with dark hair pulled back in a practical knot, and rain-dampened clothes that spoke of hard travel and little concern for appearance. Her face, in profile, held a severity softened by the emotions that moved across it as she played, grief and longing and something fiercer, something that refused surrender, that raged against the dying of light. She finished the nocturne and sat for a moment in the ringing silence, her hands still on the keys as if reluctant to break the connection. Then, without turning, she spoke. "I know you're there. I've known since you started walking. You move like someone who's forgotten how." Matthias said nothing. His voice had not worked properly in years, the muscles of throat and tongue as atrophied as everything else. She turned then, and her eyes found him in the shadows of the doorway, eyes the color of strong tea, sharp with intelligence and entirely unafraid. She studied his appearance without flinching, the paper-thin skin stretched over bones that seemed ready to pierce through, the visible veins mapping a body that had nearly forgotten circulation, the terrible thinness of a form consuming itself. "You're the owner," she said, not a question. "The last of the Valderons." He managed a nod. Even that small movement cost him, sent tremors through muscles unaccustomed to use. "I'm trespassing," she continued, her voice matter of fact, despite the strangeness of the situation. "I know. I came through the gap in the outer wall. I was looking for shelter from the storm, and then I found the piano and—" She paused, something shifting in her expression, some memory surfacing. "I haven't played in months, not since the accident. My hands—" She held them up, and he saw the scars then, the pink lines of recently healed wounds crossing her palms and fingers like a map of suffering. "The doctors said I might never play professionally again, so I stopped entirely. Couldn't bear to try and fail." She looked at the keys, then back at him, something wondering in her gaze. "But when I touched this piano, it was like my hands remembered what my mind had forgotten, like the music was waiting inside the wood, waiting for someone to release it." She frowned slightly, aware of how she sounded. "That sounds mad, doesn't it?" Matthias moved into the room, step by agonizing step, until he stood near enough to see the raindrops beating on the piano's surface. He wanted to speak, to tell her that the instrument had been enchanted centuries ago by a witch who owed him a favor, that it would always find the music inside whoever touched it, that nothing she was experiencing was madness, but rather the oldest magic there was, the magic of art calling to those who could receive it. But his voice failed him. So, instead, he simply lowered himself onto a broken chair nearby and waited, an audience of one in a concert hall of ruins. She watched him settle, curiosity replacing caution in her expression. "You look like you're dying." He nodded again. "I know the look," she said quietly, something gentling in her voice. "My mother had it at the end, that acceptance, that readiness, that look in the eyes that says the body is just waiting for permission to stop." She paused, old grief moving across her face. "I used to play for her, every night, in the hospice. The nurses said she couldn't hear anymore, but I played anyway. Chopin, always Chopin. It was her favorite." She turned back to the piano, placed her scarred fingers on the keys with the reverence of a supplicant approaching an altar. "I can't heal you," she said. "I can't save you. I don't even know your name, but I can do for you what I did for her." Her eyes met his one more time, and in them he saw something extraordinary, not pity, not fear, but a kind of fierce compassion that recognized suffering and refused to look away, that insisted on bearing witness even when witness was all that could be offered. "I can make sure you don't die in silence." And she began to play. The music opened something in him that had been sealed for centuries. As the notes of the ballad number 1 filled the ruined room, Matthias found himself pulled backward through time, through the layers of memory that had calcified around his heart like sediment around a fossil. The woman played, her scarred hands moving with impossible grace, and he remembered. Constantinople, 1453. The city falling around him, flames reflected in the waters of the Golden Horn, the greatest Christian metropolis in the world dying in fire and blood. He had been young, then merely 700 years old, and still capable of believing in causes, in loyalties, in the possibility of protecting what he loved. He had fought beside the last emperor's guard, his vampiric strength a secret weapon that had almost turned the tide. Almost, but not enough. Never enough. He remembered the taste of Greek fire and Turkish blood. The moment when the walls finally fell, Constantine the Fankit's body lost in the chaos of conquest, the 1,000-year empire ending not with a bang, but with the slow opening of gates that could no longer hold. The music shifted, and so did memory. Florence, 1494. The bonfire of the vanities. Savonarola's fanatics feeding paintings and books and musical instruments to the flames, while the mad monk preached doom from the pulpit of San Marco, his voice reaching even those who covered their ears. Matthias had stood in the crowd, watching centuries of human creation turn to ash, Botticelli's paintings and Boccaccio's verses and lutes that had played melodies now lost forever. He had felt something break inside him that night. He had killed, not out of hunger, but out of rage. 3 of Savonarola's followers, their blood singing with zealotry and certainty and righteous destruction. It was the last time he had killed in anger. The emptiness afterward had taught him that vengeance solved nothing, that destruction only bred more destruction, that even justified fury left ashes in the mouth. The music slowed, gentled, became something tender, and he remembered gentler things. Vienna, 1791. A small room in the Rauhensteingasse. Mozart, delirious with fever, dictating the final measures of his requiem, while his wife wept in the corner and Matthias sat in the shadows and listened. They had met years before, at a masked ball where Matthias had forgotten himself enough to compliment the young genius's work. Mozart had known what he was, had guessed it somehow, with that preternatural insight of his, that ability to see through surfaces to the truth beneath, and had not cared. "Death comes for everyone," the composer had said, laughing his bright, inappropriate laugh. "At least you've found a way to make it wait." Now death had stopped waiting, and Matthias had come to bear witness, to honor a friendship that had taught him that humans in their brief flowering could create beauty that made even eternity seem worthwhile. The pianist in the present did not know these stories. She played without knowledge of what her music was unlocking in her silent listener, without understanding that each phrase called forth centuries of buried experience. Yet somehow her interpretation carried the weight of all of it. The loss and rage and tenderness, the centuries of watching the mortal world spin through its cycles of creation and destruction. She played for hours. Night fell outside the broken ceiling. The rain stopped, and stars appeared in patches between drifting clouds. Ancient light from dead suns falling on this dying creature and this living woman. Still she played, and still Matthias listened, and still the memories came, each one a ghost released from its prison. Paris, 1789. The terror, that time when revolution devoured its children. He had rescued a family of children from the guillotine, spirited them away to England in the darkness of a moonless night, watched them grow old and die surrounded by grandchildren who never knew that a monster had saved their ancestors. London, 1851. The Great Exhibition in the Crystal Palace, that temple of glass and iron where humanity celebrated its own ingenuity. He had walked through the exhibits with a mortal woman who loved him, her hand warm in his cold one, knowing she would age and he would not, choosing to love her anyway because the alternative was to love nothing at all. St. Petersburg, 1917. The revolution, red against white. He had watched the old world die in the snow, had felt no particular grief for the aristocracy that had treated his kind as pets and curiosities, had wondered if this new world being born might be any better. It wasn't. The new world never was. Each memory was a wound reopened by the music, and yet somehow the music made the wounds bearable. In the pianist's hands, grief became art, loss became beauty. The terrible weight of centuries became something that could be shared, if only for a moment, if only with someone who understood suffering. When she finally stopped, her fingers trembling with exhaustion, dawn was approaching. Gray light was beginning to soften the darkness, birds beginning their morning songs in the overgrown gardens. Matthias felt a flutter of the old warning. Sunrise, danger, retreat to shadow. But it was a distant flutter, nearly drowned out by something else. His voice, unused for so long, emerged as barely more than a whisper. But emerge it did. "How did you know?" She turned, startled. "You can speak." "Apparently." The word scraped his throat like broken glass, but it was a word, the first he had spoken in years. "How did you know which pieces to play?" "I didn't." She flexed her scarred hands, staring at them as if they belonged to someone else, as if they had acted of their own volition. "The piano knew. It told me what you needed." She looked up at him, and in the growing light, he could see how tired she was, how the playing had cost her. "That sounds mad too, doesn't it?" "No," he said. "It sounds like magic." "I don't believe in magic." "Neither did I," he said, "once, before I became it." She went very still. He watched understanding dawn in her eyes, watched her gaze travel over his inhuman thinness, his visible veins, the way he shied instinctively from the growing light. She did not scream, or flee, or deny. She simply looked at him with those fierce, fearless eyes and said, "You're very old, aren't you? Older than this house, older than the language you're speaking, old enough to remember when these hills were forest, when humans were rare, Visitors to these lands when the world was wider and wilder and full of things that no longer exist. He paused, the words costing him strength he did not have, but finding their way out anyway. Old enough to be tired of remembering. She nodded slowly, accepting the impossible with the pragmatism of someone who had learned that life held stranger things than imagination could conceive. That's why you're dying, not age, weariness. Yes. Then why did you come? Why listen to me play if you've already surrendered? He had no answer. He looked at his hands, skeletal, ancient, barely capable of movement, and tried to understand what had driven him from his divan, through the ruins of his life, to this woman and her music. I don't know, he admitted finally. Perhaps I wanted to remember what beauty sounded like, before the end. She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then she stood, crossed the debris-strewn floor, and sat in a broken chair near his. My name is Vera, she said. Vera Sinclair, and I'm not ready for you to die yet. She returned the next night, and the night after that. Each evening, as dusk settled over the ruined estate like a benediction, Vera would appear at the gap in the outer wall. She carried provisions, candles and old wine bottles, blankets salvaged from the village's charity shops, thermoses of hot tea that she drank while he watched with something approaching wonder. She had found lodging in the village below, she explained, a room above a pub called the Fallen Crown. The locals had warned her about the Valderon estate, haunted, they said, cursed. No one went there anymore, had not in living memory. They're not wrong, Matthias said, his voice growing stronger each night, though his body remained weak. The estate has always been unwelcoming to uninvited guests. It welcomed me. Yes. He could not explain why. The old wards set centuries ago to repel intruders should have turned her away. They had turned away hundreds over the years, sent them stumbling back to the village with confused memories and a profound disinclination to return. Instead, the wards had parted before Vera like curtains before a queen, as if they recognized something in her that Matthias himself was only beginning to understand. It seems you were meant to find this place. Each night she played, and each night he felt something impossible happening, a stirring in the dead chambers of his heart, a warmth returning to limbs that had been cold for decades. The hunger, dormant for so long, began to wake. At first it was merely an awareness, a distant pang like remembered appetite. Then it grew, night by night, feeding not on blood, but on beauty, on the music that poured from the enchanted piano and the compassion that poured from the woman who played it. He did not tell her about the hunger, but on the seventh night, something else found them. Vera was midway through Liszt's Liebestraum, that dream of love made manifest in sound when Matthias felt it. A presence at the edges of the estate, old and familiar and entirely unwelcome. The wards, which had been so gentle with Vera, screamed in silent warning. Something ancient was pressing against them, testing for weakness, searching for entry. He raised a hand, stronger now, capable of movement, and Vera stopped playing, sensing the change in him. What is it? An old debt, he said, come to collect. The darkness in the doorway thickened and resolved into a figure, a woman of terrible beauty, with hair the color of dried blood and eyes that held no whites, only pits of absolute black that seemed to drink light rather than reflect it. She moved like smoke, like nightmare, like the memory of every fear that had ever kept a human awake in the dark. Matthias, the figure said, her voice like silk drawn over broken glass. Still alive, after all, the council will be so disappointed. Celine. The name carried the weight of centuries of enmity, of blood feuds and political machinations, and a hatred that had long since become merely tedious. You're far from the court. The court sent me. She drifted closer, her form never quite solid, never quite real. When the king of the Western Night retreats to his ruins and refuses to feed, when he chooses death over duty, the court must intervene. Her black eyes shifted to Vera, who had risen from the piano bench but had not fled. And what is this? A pet? A final meal? How touching. Leave her out of this, Matthias said. Oh, I'm afraid that's not possible. Celine smiled, revealing fangs that seemed to absorb light. You see, the council has declared you derelict. Your throne is vacant, your bloodline is forfeit, and your assets, she gestured at the crumbling walls, as such as they are, revert to the realm, including any humans who have entered your domain. Vera spoke then, her voice steady despite the terror that must have been coursing through her. I'm not an asset, I'm a person. Celine turned to her with an expression of delighted cruelty. You're food that hasn't been eaten yet. The distinction is philosophical at best. She looked back at Matthias. You have a choice, old king. Feed on her, reclaim your strength, resume your throne, or watch me drain her instead and take your crown regardless. Either way, the Western Knight will have a ruler by sunrise. The hunger roared in Matthias's veins. After a week of Vera's music, after the slow rekindling of something he had thought forever extinguished, his body screamed for blood. He could smell Vera's pulse across the room, could hear her heart beating its fierce, frightened rhythm. It would be so easy. One bite, one drink, and he would have the strength to face Selene, to defend his domain, to live for another century. The old predator in him stirred, calculating angles and distances, remembering how simple it was to kill. But he looked at Vera, at her scarred hands and her fearless eyes, and the compassion that had driven her to play for a dying stranger, and he knew he could not. I abdicate, he said. The throne is yours, Selene. Take it and go. The ancient vampire's beautiful face twisted with contempt. That's not how it works, and you know it. A king's power doesn't transfer through words. It transfers through blood. Your blood, or hers. She moved toward Vera, and Matthias did something he had not done in centuries. He attacked. His body, weakened beyond any hope of victory, launched itself at Selene with a speed born of desperation. For a single moment, the ghost of his old power flickered, the king of the Western Knight, who had once commanded armies of the undead, who had brought empires to their knees. Then Selene caught him by the throat and slammed him into the floor hard enough to crack the ancient stone. Pathetic, she hissed. You're barely more than a corpse. But don't worry. Her grip tightened. I'll make sure you last long enough to watch. The darkness rose around them, Selene's power made manifest. In moments, Matthias would be restrained beyond any hope of resistance. In moments, Vera would die. In moments, everything would end. Then Vera began to play. The first note rang through the darkness like a blade of light. Vera had not fled. She had returned to the piano, the enchanted piano that had called to her across miles and years, and her scarred hands struck the keys with a fury that made the music almost visible, a wave of sound that crashed against Selene's shadows and scattered them like leaves in a gale. Selene screamed. The sound was inhuman, a shriek of rage and disbelief that shattered what windows remained in the ruined room. What is this? What magic? But it was not magic, not in the way the vampire understood it. It was something older, something that predated spells and curses and the dark gifts of the undead. It was the power that had existed since the first human heart had beaten in rhythm with the universe, the power that had always lived in music and always would, the power of beauty to confront darkness, of creation to challenge destruction, of hope to survive despair. Vera played, the ballade in G minor, Chopin's most tempestuous work, a storm of notes that built and built toward an inevitable, devastating climax. Her hands flew across the keys, the scars on her fingers catching the candlelight, and each note drove the darkness back another inch. She played not for applause, not for recognition, not for anything but the man on the floor who had listened when no one else would. Selene released Matthias to claw at her own ears, but the music penetrated anyway. It was not loud. The piano was 200 years old, its voice softened by time. But it was inexorable, undeniable, a force that spoke directly to whatever remained of a soul, even in the oldest and most corrupted of beings. Matthias crawled toward Vera. He did not know what he intended to do, protect her, thank her, simply be near her when the end came. His body was broken, his strength spent. But the music was doing something to him too, unlocking something, releasing something that had been bound for so long he had forgotten it existed. He remembered. Not the pain, not the loss, not the endless parade of deaths and griefs that had driven him to seek his own end. He remembered the other things, the first sunrise he had ever seen as a human child in an age before written history, the face of his mother, dead for more millennia than the pyramids had stood, the feeling of grass beneath his feet, of water on his skin, of laughter shared with friends whose names were older than language itself. He remembered what it had felt like to want to live. The music reached its climax. Vera's hand slammed down on the final chord, and the sound seemed to shake the foundations of the estate itself. Selene, caught in that wave of terrible beauty, made one last desperate lunge toward the pianist. Matthias intercepted her. He should not have had the strength. He should not have been able to move, let alone fight. But the music had awakened something in him, something that transcended physical strength, the will to protect, the refusal to let another beautiful thing be destroyed while he watched. His teeth found Selene's throat. The blood of an ancient vampire was not like human blood. It was fire and ice and the distilled essence of darkness itself. It poured into Matthias, and he felt himself transforming, not becoming stronger, not becoming younger, but becoming more himself than he had been in centuries. The weariness began to lift. The death that had been creeping through his veins receded. He drank, and Selena weakened. And when he finally released her, she collapsed to the floor like a marionette with cut strings. "This isn't over," she whispered. "The court will send others." "Let them come," Matthias said. His voice was strong now, strong and clear and alive in a way it had not been for longer than he could remember. "Let them come, and I will meet them. But not tonight. Tonight you will return to the court and tell them that the king of the Western Night still lives, that he has found something worth living for, that anyone who threatens what is his will face the same fate as you." Celine's black eyes held murder and promise of vengeance, but she was too weak to act on either. She dissolved into shadow and was gone, leaving only the smell of ancient blood and the fading echo of her scream. Matthias turned to Vera. She sat at the piano, her hands trembling now that the music had stopped, her face pale with the enormity of what she had witnessed. But she did not look away. She met his eyes, his stronger eyes, his living eyes, and she said, "You fed on her." "Yes." "You could have fed on me." "Yes." "Why didn't you?" He crossed the room slowly, not because he lacked strength, but because he wanted to give her time to flee if she chose. She did not choose. He knelt before the piano bench, this ancient king, this monster who had terrorized empires, and he looked up at the mortal woman who had saved him. "Because you played for me," he said. "Because you saw me dying and you didn't look away. Because in all my centuries of existence, no one has ever given me a gift as precious as your music." He reached out hesitantly and touched her scarred hand. "Because I would rather die truly dead than take a single drop of your blood against your will." Vera looked at her hand in his cold hand, his ancient hand, the hand of a creature she should by all rights fear and despise. Then she turned her palm up and interlaced her fingers with his. "I'm not afraid of you," she said. "I know. I should be. Probably." A ghost of a smile crossed her face. "Play for me again tomorrow?" "Every night," she said, "for as long as you want to listen." "That could be a very long time." "I know." She squeezed his hand. "I'm counting on it." Months passed, and the Valderon estate began to heal. Thomas, the elderly caretaker, wept the first time he saw his master standing upright, walking through the halls with something approaching vitality. Matthias had laughed, actually laughed, a sound that had not echoed through those corridors in over a century, and embraced the old man like the son he had never had. Workers came to repair the east wing. The roof was rebuilt, the debris cleared, the windows replaced with glass that caught the moonlight like jewels. The piano remained where it had always been, but now the room around it gleamed with fresh paint and polished wood. Vera insisted on overseeing the restoration herself, consulting with architects and craftsmen, ensuring that each detail honored both the past and the future. "This is where it happened," she told Matthias. "This is where everything changed. It should be beautiful." It was beautiful. The entire estate was becoming beautiful again, touched by a vitality that seemed to emanate from the bond between its master and his pianist. The gardens that had gone wild with neglect began to bloom under the care of newly hired groundskeepers. The library was dusted, organized, open to scholars who came from across Europe to study its treasures. The village below, which had shunned the cursed house for generations, began to whisper different stories. Stories of lights in the windows at night, of music drifting down from the hills, of a reclusive lord who had finally found reasons to live. Vera stayed. She had meant to leave after that first week. She had a life elsewhere, a career to rebuild, a future to reclaim. But the days stretched into weeks, the weeks into months, and somehow leaving became impossible. Not because Matthias asked her to stay, he never asked, but because every night when she sat at the enchanted piano and played for him, she felt something she had never felt before. A sense of purpose that transcended her own ambitions, a connection that went deeper than anything she had known with her own kind. They talked in the hours between music and dawn. He told her stories of the centuries he had witnessed, the rise and fall of civilizations, the artists and monsters he had known, the slow evolution of humanity from scattered tribes to global community. She told him about her own small life, her years of training, her career cut short by a car accident, the despair that had driven her to wander until she found his ruined home. "I was dying too," she admitted one night as they sat together in the restored East Wing, candlelight flickering on the walls. Not physically, but something in me had given up. I couldn't see a future worth living. And now I see centuries of futures, she smiled. With you. He took her hand, a gesture that had become habit, this ancient vampire king holding the scarred hand of a mortal pianist. I cannot give you eternity, he said, not without making you like me, and I will never ask that of you. I know. You will age, you will die, I will watch it happen, and there will be nothing I can do. I know that too, and still you stay. Matthias. She turned to face him fully, her eyes holding that same fierce compassion that had first drawn him from his dying sleep. I played piano for years, trying to find transcendence, trying to create something that would outlast me, music that would echo after I was gone. She touched his face, the face that was no longer gaunt and dying, the face that had grown strong and almost young under the influence of her presence. Don't you understand? I have found it, not in a recording or a performance or any immortal work of art. I have found it in you. Every note I play lives inside you now. Every piece of music I share with you will echo in your memory for eternity. I am already immortal through you. He had no words for what he felt, so he did what he had learned to do in the months since she found him. He listened to the silence between heartbeats, the music that existed in the spaces between notes, the eternal song that had always played beneath the surface of existence. And in that silence, he heard her love and knew it for what it was, a gift greater than blood, greater than power, greater than all the centuries he had lived or would ever live. Stay, he said finally. Not forever, not eternity, just stay. For as long as you want, for as long as the music lasts. That's all I've ever wanted, she said. To play for someone who truly hears. Outside, the moon rose over the restored estate, silver light spilling through windows that no longer feared the dawn. In the distance, the village slept peacefully, no longer haunted by stories of curses and monsters. And in the East Wing, in a room that had been rebuilt around an ancient enchanted piano, a vampire king and a mortal pianist sat together in perfect silence. She would play again soon. She always did. And he would listen, as he always would, until the end of her days and beyond, carrying her music forward through the long nights that stretched into eternity. This was not a happily ever after. It was something stranger, something sadder, something more beautiful, a love that acknowledged its own ending and chose to exist anyway. A connection that defied the mathematics of mortality. A song that would never truly stop playing, even when the pianist's hands finally stilled. The king of the Western night had found his court again. It was small, just two souls in a room full of music, but it was enough. It would always be enough. In the shadows of the Valderon estate, where dust motes danced in moonlight and centuries of memory hung heavy in the air, an immortal and a mortal sat together and waited for the music to begin again. It always did. It always would.